In the Arizona Territory of 1878, the land didn't just take your sweat, it took your hope. For Abigail Miller, a widow with nothing but a failing homestead and the ghost of a husband, the earth was a graveyard of dreams. The sun baked the ground into a tombstone, and every gust of wind felt like a final exhale. She thought her life was over, a quiet story of loss fading into the dust. She was wrong, because on the night the sky finally broke, it didn't just bring rain. It brought two giants to her doorstep, bleeding broken and Apache. She offered them mercy. What they offered her in return would either be her salvation or her ruin. This is the story of how one woman's act of compassion rewrote the laws of survival and love in a land that had none. The dust was a living thing. It coated Abigail Miller's tongue, settled in the lines around her eyes, and worked its way into the very grain of the wooden cross that marked her husband's grave. Thomas had been gone 2 years, taken not by a bullet or a rattler, but by a fever that burned through him like a wildfire, leaving her in an ash heap of a life. Their homestead, 10 miles from the nearest spit and sawdust town of Cutter's Creek, was a testament to failed ambition. The well was threatening to run dry, the corn stalks were brittle yellowed skeletons, and the small cabin felt less like a home and more like a tomb she was tending. At 28, Abigail felt ancient. Her hands were calloused, her face weathered by a sun that offered no kindness, only a relentless baking glare. Loneliness was a constant companion, a silent figure sitting across from her at the small, rough-hewn table. Sometimes she would speak to it, her voice a dry rasp. "Well, Thomas," she'd murmur, looking at the empty chair, "another fine day in paradise." The day she found them began like any other with a prayer the sky refused to answer. The air was thick and heavy, the color of rust. A storm was coming, but not the kind that brought life. This was a dust storm, a brown monster that rose from the horizon to swallow the world whole. Abigail secured the shutters, tied a rope from the cabin door to the barn so she wouldn't get lost in the blinding chaos, and brought the last of the chickens inside. For hours the world was fury and grit. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and fine sand seeped through every crack in the cabin walls, covering everything in a fine ochre film. Abigail sat in the dark, the shotgun resting across her lap, listening to the world being scoured down to the bone. When silence finally fell near dusk, it was absolute and unnerving. The air was cool, the dust settling like a shroud. Cautiously, Abigail opened the door. The landscape was transformed, softened into rolling dunes of red sand, the familiar contours of her land erased. A strange coppery light bled from the bruised purple sky. It was the unnatural stillness that drew her attention to the wash, a deep, rocky ravine 50 yards from her cabin. During the rare rains, it could become a raging river. Now it was just a scar on the land. But something was different. A dark shape, or rather two, lay crumpled near a cluster of jagged rocks. Coyotes may be caught in the storm. With the shotgun held tight, she made her way toward them. The ground was soft under her boots. As she drew closer, the shapes resolved themselves. Not animals. Men. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were Apache. Even from a distance, their heritage was unmistakable in the long, dark hair, the high cheekbones, and the style of their buckskin leggings now torn and stained. They were massive, larger than any men she had ever seen, built on a scale that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves. One was lying face down, a dark, wet patch spreading across his back. The other was propped against a rock, his head slumped to his chest, a crude, bloody bandage tied around his thigh. Abigail froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run to bolt the cabin door and pray they died before they woke. She was a lone woman. These were Apache warriors. The stories told in Cutter's Creek were whispered nightmares of raids, scalpings, and unspeakable violence. Helping them was suicide. The town would ostracize her at best, lynch her at worst. She took a step back, then another. She could just walk away. The storm had brought them. The desert would claim them. It was the law of this land. But as she turned, a low groan cut through the silence. It wasn't the sound of a savage beast. It was the sound of a man in agony, a sound she remembered all too well from Thomas's final days. It was a sound of pure, helpless suffering. Her feet stopped moving. She looked from the relative safety of her cabin to the two broken men in the wash. Her husband had been a good man, but a cautious one. He would have told her to leave them. But Thomas was gone, and his caution had died, with him buried under 6 feet of unforgiving earth. All she had left was herself. Cursing her own foolish, tender heart, Abigail squared her shoulders. She checked the load in her shotgun, took a deep breath that was more dust than air, and started walking down into the wash. She was a widow with nothing left to lose, and that she was beginning to realize was its own kind of freedom. Fear was a cold knot in Abigail's stomach as she descended into the ravine. The air was thick with the scent of blood and ozone. The two men were even larger up close, their limbs long and corded with muscle, their shoulders broad enough to block out the dying light. They were twins. Their faces, though one was contorted in pain and the other slack with unconsciousness, were identical mirrors of sharp angles and proud sculpted lines. The one leaning against the rock stirred as she approached. His eyes, dark and fathomless, flickered open. They were filled with a burning, defiant hatred. His hand went to the empty sheath at his belt. "Easy now," Abigail said, her voice steadier than she felt. She held the shotgun loosely, not aiming it, but not hiding it either. "I'm not here to cause more harm." He said nothing, just watched her with an unnerving intensity, his breath coming in ragged pants. He was assessing her, weighing her threat. His gaze dropped to the shotgun, then back to her face. Abigail ignored him for a moment and knelt by the man lying face down. Gently, she probed the edges of the wound on his back. It was a deep gash, likely from a knife crusted with blood and sand. He was breathing, but it was shallow. He needed help, and soon. "I have a cabin," she said, looking back at the conscious twin. "Water. Medicine. You'll die out here." He spat a word at her in his own tongue, the meaning clear in its venomous tone. He didn't want her help. He didn't trust it. Abigail understood. In his world, a white woman with a shotgun was likely the prelude to something far worse. "Look," she said, her patience fraying. "You can die full of pride in this ditch, or you can live to hate me another day from under a roof. Your choice. But I'm not leaving your brother to the coyotes." The mention of his brother seemed to break through his wall of hostility. His eyes flickered to the still form on the ground, and for a second the hatred was replaced by a raw, agonizing fear. That was the language she understood. It was the same fear she'd felt watching Thomas fade. He gave a short, sharp nod. The next hour was a grueling ordeal. The conscious twin, despite the gushing wound in his thigh, refused to let her help him until his brother was safe. He showed her how to bind their wrists to create a drag sling. Getting the unconscious one up the slippery side of the wash was a nightmare. He was dead weight, a mountain of a man she could barely move. The conscious twin pushed from behind his face, pale and slick with sweat, his jaw clenched against the pain. Finally they got him inside the cabin and onto her small cot which groaned under his weight. Then she helped the other one, guiding him to a pallet of blankets she'd laid by the hearth. The cabin, which had always felt so empty, was now overwhelmingly full. Their sheer size seemed to shrink the room, their presence a palpable force. The air smelled of sweat blood and the wild, earthy scent of the desert. For the rest of the night and into the next day, Abigail worked tirelessly. She boiled water, cleaned their wounds with carbolic soap she usually saved for laundry, and stitched their skin back together with a needle and thread meant for mending clothes. The gash on the one's back took 20 stitches. The leg wound on the other was a deep puncture, angry and inflamed. She packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey remedies a kindly Pima woman had taught her years ago. They never spoke. The conscious one whose leg she'd tended watched her every move with an unnerving, silent scrutiny. He refused her food and water, at first, only accepting it after she took a sip or bite from it herself to prove it wasn't poisoned. The unconscious one remained lost to the world, his breathing shallow, his skin hot to the touch. She learned their rhythms. The silent one, the one with the leg wound, would sit sentinel, barely sleeping, his hand never far from a wicked-looking knife he'd kept hidden in his boot. He would tend to his brother, bathing his forehead with a damp rag, his massive hands surprisingly gentle. On the third day, the fever broke. The twin on the cot opened his eyes. They were the same dark, intense eyes as his brother's, but they held a different light, less fire, more shadow. He took in the cabin, his brother sitting nearby, and finally Abigail standing by the stove. His brother spoke to him in their native tongue, a series of low, guttural sounds. The one on the cot listened, his gaze fixed on Abigail. When his brother finished, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the man on the cot pushed himself up on one elbow. He looked directly at her, and in a voice rough from disuse, he spoke a single clear English word. Why, Abigail paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at these two men, these dangerous strangers who had turned her life upside down. She could have given a dozen answers, that she was a Christian woman, that it was the right thing to do, that she was lonely. But none of those felt entirely true. She met his gaze and gave him the only honest answer she had. Because no one deserves to die alone in the dirt. The answer seemed to satisfy him. He laid his head back on the pillow, his eyes closing. His brother, the silent sentinel, watched her for a long moment, the suspicion in his eyes warring with something else, something she couldn't yet name. A fragile, unspoken truce had been forged in the small, dusty cabin, but Abigail knew truces in this land were as fleeting as a shadow at noon. The days that followed settled into a strange domesticity. The twins healed with a speed that astonished Abigail. Their powerful bodies seemed to knit themselves back together, fueled by the thin rabbit stew and cornbread she provided. They began to help their presence, transforming the homestead. The one she had found conscious, the watcher, was named Husk. The name suited him. It felt sharp like the edge of a blade. He was a man of few words but immense action. He moved with a restless energy, chopping firewood with an axe that looked like a toy in his hands, reinforcing the flimsy corral fence and watching the horizon with the vigilance of a hawk. There was a coiled anger in him, a rage at his own weakness, at the world that had brought him low. The other, the quieter one with the wound in his back, was Nantan. His presence was a stark contrast to his brother's. Where Haska was fire, Nantan was stone, solid, observant, and thoughtful. He spoke more English, his words careful and measured. He showed Abigail how to track the patterns of the quail, how to find the hidden water seeping from rocks she'd always thought were dry. He taught her how to read the clouds, not just for rain, but for wind and dust. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire, the silence no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with a quiet understanding. Abigail found herself talking, telling them about Thomas, about her dreams of a green farm, a life that had withered on the vine. They listened, their dark eyes reflecting the firelight, offering no pity, only a deep, resonant attention that made her feel seen for the first time in years. They told her little of their own story, only that they were pursued, that they had been ambushed by men, white men from the sound of it, who wanted the bounty on their heads. They were Chiricahua, a name that sent a shiver of fear and respect through the territory. One night, a week after she'd found them, Abigail was startled awake by a sound. It was a low murmur coming from the main room. She crept to the doorway of her small bedroom, her heart beating fast. Husk and Nantan were sitting by the dying embers of the fire, speaking to each other in the soft flowing cadences of their own language. The cabin was bathed in moonlight, casting their large frames in silver and shadow. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was serious, intense. After a long while, they fell silent. She thought they were finished, that she could slip back to bed unnoticed. But then Nantan spoke, his English voice soft, but clear in the stillness. "We know you are awake, Abigail." She froze her hand on the doorframe. Slowly she stepped into the room. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop. It does not matter," Haskell said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't turn to look at her, his gaze fixed on the glowing coals. Nantan gestured to the small stool near the hearth. "Sit. We must speak with you." A knot of apprehension tightened in her chest. Were they leaving, or worse? She sat, her hands clenched in the fabric of her nightgown. Nantan looked at his brother, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then Nantan turned his full attention to her. His gaze was so direct, it felt like a physical touch. "You saved us," he began, his voice simple and direct. "You gave us shelter when your people would have given us a rope. You tended our wounds. You shared your food when you have little. You have a strong spirit, a good heart." "I did what anyone would have," she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, not anyone," he corrected gently. You did this." Hask finally turned to look at her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the air crackle. "We have nothing to pay you with. We have no horses, no silver. All we have is our strength, our lives which you returned to us." Abigail shook her head. "I don't want payment. I just want—" She didn't know what she wanted. For them to be safe. For her to be safe. It was then that the conversation took a turn so sharp and unexpected that it stole the breath from her lungs. "We will not leave you," Nantan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This land is hard. It is not meant for one woman alone. We have seen the way the buzzards circle. We have seen the hunger in your eyes. We will stay," Hask added, his voice a gravelly echo of his brother's. "We will protect you. We will work this land. We will make it live again." Abigail stared at them, confused. As hired hands, the idea was absurd. Two Chiricahua warriors working for a broke widow. Nantan's expression was unreadable. No, not as hired hands. He reached out his large, calloused hand, hovering just inches from her knee before he let it fall. The space between them tingled. "In our way," Nantan said, slowly choosing his words with immense care. "When a bond like this is forged in blood and spirit, it is a powerful thing. It cannot be ignored. We are tied to you now, and you to us." Haskell's gaze locked with hers. The fire in his eyes was not anger now. It was something else, something primal and unsettlingly possessive. "We want you," he whispered, and the words seemed to be torn from the deepest part of him. To be ours, Nantan's voice followed, weaving around his brothers, and we to be yours. Together. Abigail's mind reeled. She stared at them, at these two enormous, powerful men, their faces earnest and deadly serious in the moonlight. They weren't propositioning her in the crude way a drunk cowboy might in a saloon. This was something else entirely. It was a declaration, a proposal so far outside the bounds of her world that she couldn't even process it. One woman, two men, two Apache warriors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Fear shock and a strange, terrifying flicker of something else. Something warm and electric coursed through her. She was speechless, her world irrevocably fractured by a whisper in the night. Abigail didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She lay on her thin mattress, the twins' words echoing in the darkness. We want you. Together. It was madness. It was blasphemy. It defied every rule of God and man she had ever known. Yet beneath the shock and the fear, a deeper, more treacherous part of her felt a tremor of something that wasn't revulsion. It was the feeling of being wanted, of being seen as something powerful and desirable, not as a pitiful charity case of a widow. It was a feeling she had long forgotten. She avoided them the next morning, her movement stiff and awkward. She fed the chickens kneaded bread with a frantic energy, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. They didn't press her. They simply went about their work, their presence, a silent, constant question. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. Her turmoil was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. It was a sound she hadn't heard in months, and it sent a jolt of pure panic through her. Inside. Now she hissed at Hasker, who was splitting logs near the porch. He didn't question her. With a glance at Nantan, who was already melting back into the shadows of the barn, Hasker disappeared into the cabin, just as a polished black buggy pulled up drawn by a handsome bay mare. The man who stepped down was the architect of Cutter's Creek's prosperity and its misery, Peter Croft. He was a man of middle years, dressed in a fine wool suit that defied the dust and heat. His face was smooth, his smile practiced, but his eyes were like chips of flint, cold and hard. He owned the bank, the general store, and held the mortgage on half the homesteads in the county, including hers. Abigail, my dear, he said, his voice, a slick, oily sound that set her teeth on edge. He removed his hat, revealing perfectly coiffed greying hair. I was just passing through the area. Thought I'd check in on our most resilient homesteader. Mr. Croft, Abigail said, her voice tight. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her body a rigid wall between him and the cabin door. What do you want? Peter's smile didn't waver. Always so direct. It's one of your rustic charms. I've come about a delicate matter, the matter of your late husband's outstanding debt. Abigail's stomach plummeted. Thomas had taken a loan from Croft 2 years ago to buy seed and a new plough after a drought. She had been making meagre payments, selling off chickens, and even her own mother's locket to scrape the money together. The payment isn't due for another 2 weeks, she said. Ah, but circumstances have changed, Croft said, stepping closer. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of false sympathy. I've been reviewing my ledgers. It seems Thomas, God rest his soul, was a bit more financially entangled than you might have known. There were other loans, advances. The interest, I'm afraid, has compounded rather severely. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. The long and short of it, my dear, is that your debt is now insurmountable. The total amount is Well, it's far more than this patch of dust could ever produce. No, Abigail whispered, her blood turning to ice. That can't be. Thomas would have told me. Grief does strange things to the memory, Croft said smoothly. Men often try to shield their wives from such burdens, a misguided chivalry. He let the lie hang in the air. But I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to make you an offer. I will forgive the entire debt, every last penny. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in Abigail's chest. You would. In exchange, he continued, his eyes roaming over the property with a covetous gleam for the deed to this land. I have plans, you see. The railroad is considering a spur line through this valley. Land here will soon be very valuable. He was offering to forgive a debt she couldn't pay in exchange for land he knew was a future gold mine. He was a vulture, picking her bones clean. And where would I go? She asked, her voice trembling with a rage she struggled to contain. Croft shrugged, a picture of indifference. A woman like you. Resourceful. You could find work in Cutter's Creek. Perhaps at the saloon. I hear Mildred is looking for a new girl to serve drinks. The insult was as sharp as a slap. He was offering her destitution and disgrace. Get off my land, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Croft's mask of civility finally dropped. His eyes narrowed. You are in no position to make demands, Abigail. You have 1 week. Sign the deed, or my associate Sheriff Bartholomew Cole will be out here to serve you with an eviction notice. The law is on my side. Think about it. It's this, or you're out on your ear with nothing but the clothes on your back. He placed the papers on the porch railing. 1 week, Abigail. He climbed back into his buggy and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his cruel victory in the air. Abigail stood there, shaking the world tilting on its axis. She was ruined. Utterly and completely ruined. Her last connection to Thomas, the home they had built, was about to be ripped away by a snake in a wool suit. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Husky stepped out, his face a thundercloud of fury. Nantan emerged from the barn, his expression grim. They had heard everything. Husky looked at the departing buggy, then at the papers on the railing. He spat on the ground. This is the man your law protects. Abigail couldn't answer. She slumped against the porch post, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. Nantan came to stand before her. His presence was calming a rock in the swirling tide of her panic. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a deep, unwavering resolve. He will not take your home. Nantan said, his voice quiet but absolute. We will not let him, Hask vowed, coming to stand beside his brother. They stood before her, 2 giants of the earth, a living wall between her and the world that sought to crush her. And in that moment, their impossible, unthinkable proposal from the night before no longer sounded like madness. It sounded like the only hope she had left. Desperation is a powerful acid. It burns away pride, melts conviction, and dissolves the boundaries of what one deems possible. Abigail looked at the eviction papers. Peter Croft had left a legal death warrant for her life on the homestead, and felt that acid at work within her. The world she knew, with its rigid rules and church-sanctioned morals, had offered her nothing but ruin. That evening she faced the twins across the hearth. The firelight danced on their stoic faces, illuminating the choice before her. On one side was destitution and the predatory pity of Cutter's Creek. On the other was them. An arrangement so scandalous it had no name, a pact with 2 men who were considered less than human by the very society that was casting her out. Your offer, she began, her voice barely a whisper. From the other night. I need to understand. Nantan nodded, his gaze steady. It is not what you think. It is not about a man's. Appetite. He paused, searching for the right words. In our people there are stories of twins who share one spirit. Their lives, their fates are entwined. Hask is the fist. I am the mind. We are two halves of a whole. What we offer is the protection of that whole. A white woman cannot be wife to an Apache. Abigail stated the words tasting like ash, let alone two. We do not ask you to be a wife in the way your people see it. Hask interjected, his voice rough. We ask you to be the heart of our circle, the center. We will be your shield, your hands, your will upon this land. In return, you give us a home, a place to stand, a reason to fight. It was a contract of survival, stripped bare of the niceties of courtship or the sanction of a preacher. It was primal, practical, and terrifying. She looked from Hask's fierce, possessive glare to Nantan's calm, reassuring strength. They were offering her a fortress, not a marriage. They were offering her a future, however strange and perilous its shape might be. If I agree, she said the words, catching in her throat. What happens we work, Nantan said simply. We make this land obey. We face the man Croft when he returns. And when he brings the law, she pressed. The law of men with paper is not the only law, Haske growled. There is the law of the gun, the law of the knife. He will find we are not so easily evicted. Abigail took a long, shaky breath. She thought of Thomas, of the simple, conventional life they had planned. What would he think? But Thomas was gone. His world had failed her. She had to build a new one from the wreckage. All right, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I agree. The moment the word left her lips, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The tension didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the tension of uncertainty, but the charged energy of a pact being sealed. A silent, solemn vow passed between the three of them, more binding than any word spoken before a judge. The days that followed were a blur of relentless labor. The homestead, which had been withering under her solitary efforts, began to stir with new life. Haske was a force of nature. He cleared the rock-strewn field. Thomas had given up on his muscles, straining as he heaved boulders she couldn't have budged with a team of oxen. He dug the well deeper, finding a new, stronger vein of water that gurgled with a sound like laughter. His fierce energy, once a source of intimidation, was now a shield around her, a promise that the physical world could be subdued. Nantan was the strategist. He analyzed the sun, the soil, the flow of water. He showed her how to build small check dams in the wash to capture runoff from the next rain, how to plant the corn in spirals that followed the land's contours to conserve moisture. He was the one who fixed the broken pump, his long, clever fingers patiently reassembling the mechanism. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his mind always 5 steps ahead. Abigail found her own role changing. She was no longer just a survivor, but the anchor of their strange trio. She managed their dwindling supplies with shrewd care, cooked the meals that fueled their incredible labor, and tended to the garden with a renewed sense of purpose. Slowly, tentatively, the lines of their arrangement began to blur. One sweltering afternoon, as she brought water to the field, she watched Haske stripped to the waist, his bronze skin gleaming with sweat as he swung a pickaxe. He stopped when he saw her, his chest heaving, and gave her a look of such raw masculine pride that it made her cheeks burn. It wasn't a leer, it was a statement. This I do for you. Another evening, she found Nantan on the porch, carefully carving a small wooden bird. He explained it was a talisman for a safe home. He wasn't just working the land, he was weaving his spirit into it, into her life. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers, and the brief contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with survival. and everything to do with a nascent, terrifying intimacy. They slept on their pallets by the hearth, never encroaching on her bedroom, but their presence filled the house, even in sleep. She would lie awake, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing, a strange sense of security washing over her. She, a lone woman, was being guarded by two of the most formidable men she could imagine. But their newfound peace was a fragile bubble in a hostile world. 1 week to the day after Peter Croft's visit, Abigail looked up from her mending to see a plume of dust on the horizon. It wasn't a single buggy this time. It was 3 riders. Haske, who was sharpening an axe head on the porch, went still. Nantan emerged from the barn, his face grim. The time for work was over. The time for fighting had come. "Stay inside," Nantan commanded, his voice low but firm. Abigail's heart hammered, but she shook her head. "No. This is my home. I'll face them with you." Haske looked at her, and a flicker of something respect approval danced in his fiery eyes. He gave a sharp nod. Abigail went inside and returned with Thomas's shotgun, her hands steady. She stood on the porch between the 2 brothers, a small, determined figure flanked by giants, and waited for the devil from Cutter's Creek to arrive. The 3 riders were Peter Croft Sheriff Bartholomew Cole and a hired thug named Finn, a man whose broken nose and dead eyes spoke of a life of casual cruelty. The sheriff, a man Abigail had known for years, looked deeply uncomfortable. He was a decent man, caught in the gears of Croft's influence, his badge a tool for the town's most powerful citizen. They reined in their horses a safe distance from the porch. Croft's eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene. He had expected a weeping, defeated widow. He had not expected her to be flanked by 2 enormous, battle-scarred Apache warriors, armed with a shared, defiant glare. Abigail Croft began recovering his composure. "I see you've acquired some company." "I trust you have the signed deed. I have nothing for you, Peter Abigail," said her voice, ringing with newfound confidence. "Except a request that you leave my property." Croft chuckled a humorless, ugly sound. "Your property, I believe this paper says otherwise." He gestured to Sheriff Cole. "Barty, do your duty. Serve the notice." Sheriff Cole dismounted, his face etched with reluctance. He held out the official eviction notice. "Abigail, I'm sorry about this, but the law's the law. Mr. Croft has a legal claim." Before he could take another step, Haske moved. He didn't say a word. He simply took 1 step forward, planting himself in the sheriff's path. He crossed his massive arms over his chest. The message was unmistakable. There would be no further advance. Finn, the hired gun, smirked and rested a hand on the butt of his pistol. "Looks like the lady's pets need to be put on a leash, Sheriff." Nantan's voice cut through the tension, calm and cold as riverstone. "This is a private matter. The sheriff is welcome. The banker and his dog are not. Leave now." The confrontation was a stalemate. The sheriff was a man of the law, not a killer. He wasn't about to start a shootout over a civil matter. Finn was eager for violence, but not against 2 opponents of this caliber, not without a clear advantage. And Croft, for all his power, was a coward at heart. "You're making a grave mistake," Abigail Croft sneered, his face flushed with anger. "Harboring wanted fugitives, resisting a lawful eviction. You'll hang for this." He spurred his horse, turning back toward town. His parting shot a promise of retribution. "You've chosen your side. Now you'll see what it costs you." Sheriff Cole gave Abigail a pained look, tipped his hat, and followed with Finn, casting one last malevolent glare over his shoulder. The immediate threat was gone, but they all knew it was just the beginning. Croft would not use the law now. He would use the town. And he did. The next time Abigail rode their old mule into Cutter's Creek for supplies, the change was palpable. Doors closed as she passed. Women who used to greet her now turned their backs, whispering behind their hands. At the general store which Croft owned, the clerk, a young man named Peterson, refused to serve her. "We don't serve her kind here," he said, not meeting her eyes. "What kind is that, Mr. Peterson?" Abigail challenged, her voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. "A widow trying to keep her home, the kind that beds down with heathen savages," a woman hissed from the back of the store. The poison had spread quickly. Croft had painted her as a traitor to her race, an Indian lover who had taken up with murderous renegades. It was a simple, ugly story that played on the town's deepest fears and prejudices. Abigail left empty-handed, her cheeks burning with shame and fury. When she told Nantan and Husky what had happened, Husky's rage was a storm waiting to break. He wanted to ride into town to drag the clerk out by his collar, to make them understand respect through fear. It was Nantan who calmed him. "Anger is a weapon they expect us to use," he said, his hand on his brother's shoulder. "It will only prove their stories right. We will not fight on their terms." Instead, they adapted. They became an island, a self-sufficient world of three. Nantan taught Abigail which desert plants were edible, which roots held water. Husky's skill as a hunter kept them supplied with meat. They were cut off, but they were surviving. More than surviving, they were thriving in their defiance. The bond between them deepened, forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The lines of their initial agreement had long since vanished. Abigail no longer saw them as just her protectors. She saw them as her partners. She saw the humor in Nantan's quiet smile when she finally mastered the art of setting a snare. She felt a surge of pride in Hosk's grunted approval when she learned to shoot the shotgun with a steady hand. And the nights were different now. The tension was no longer one of fear or uncertainty, but of a slow-burning intimacy. Sometimes, sitting by the fire, Husky would reach out and braid a piece of leather into her hair, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. Other times, she would find Nantan watching her, his dark eyes filled with a profound unspoken emotion that made her heart ache. They still slept on their pallets, but the space between them and her bed seemed to shrink with each passing day. She knew a boundary would soon be crossed, a final wall would come down. The thought no longer terrified her. It felt inevitable. It felt right. But Peter Croft was not a man to be ignored. He had been stewing his humiliation, festering into a murderous rage. If the town's shunning wouldn't drive her out, he would resort to more direct methods. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky, Nantan, who was watching the horizon, went utterly still. "They are coming," he said, his voice a low warning. Abigail's blood ran cold. She looked out into the darkness. At first she saw nothing. Then she saw them. Not 3 riders this time, a dozen. And they weren't carrying eviction notices. They were carrying torches. The flickering lights grew steadily closer, a swarm of angry fireflies intent on burning their world to the ground. There was no pretense of law now. This was a lynch mob. "Abigail, get inside. Bar the door," Nantan commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. He and Husky grabbed their knives and the bows Nantan had painstakingly crafted from juniper wood. They were weapons of silence and shadow. "No," Abigail said, clutching the shotgun. "I'm not hiding. They want to fight. They'll get one from all 3 of us." A rare, fierce grin split Husky's face. "She has the spirit of a she-wolf." There was no time to argue. The riders were at the edge of the property, their drunken yells and curses soiling the night air. Peter Croft and Finn were at the head of the mob, their faces illuminated by the torchlight twisted with hate. "Burn it!" Croft screamed. "Burn the whole rotten place and smoke the filth out." The plan was brutally simple. Nantan would use the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain to circle around them, a ghost in the night, picking them off from the shadows. Hask, a terrifying spectre of vengeance, would meet their charge head-on. Abigail's job was to hold the porch the last line of defense. The first torch arced through the air, landing on the roof of the barn. The dry timber caught instantly flames, licking up into the sky. Another followed, hitting the side of the cabin. As the mob surged forward, a shape erupted from the darkness to their right. It was Haske. He moved not like a man, but like an avalanche. The first rider didn't even see him coming. Haske tore the man from his saddle, and the man's scream was cut short with a sickening crunch. He seized another, using him as a shield against a panicked gunshot before throwing him into a third. He was a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence, his war cry a terrifying roar that ripped through the night. At the same time, an arrow hissed out of the darkness from the left, and one of the torchbearers crumpled to the ground, clutching his throat. Then another. Nantan was a phantom, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision, sowing chaos and fear in the attackers' ranks. Abigail stood on the porch, the cabin wall at her back, smoke stinging her eyes. Two of the mob broke through their faces, lit by the fire, their eyes wide with bloodlust. She raised the shotgun, the stock firm against her shoulder, just as Haske had taught her. She didn't think. She just acted. The weapon boomed its kick, jarring her to the bone. One of the men was thrown backward, as if punched by a giant fist. The other hesitated, his eyes full of shock, and that was all the time she needed to rack the second shell and fire again. The fight was a chaotic, hellish symphony of screams, gunshots, and the roar of the fire. The homesteaders who had come for an easy lynching found themselves in a meat grinder. They were farmers and drunks, not fighters. They broke and ran, melting back into the darkness, their courage extinguished as quickly as it had been ignited. But the leaders remained. Finn, the hired gun, saw Hask wrestling with two men and took his chance. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Haske's exposed back. "Haske, look out!" Abigail screamed. Haske turned, but it was too late. The gun fired and Haske grunted, staggering back, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, but the wound had slowed him. Before Finn could fire again, an arrow sprouted from his shooting hand. He shrieked, dropping the pistol, as Nantan emerged from the shadows like a wraith, his knife gleaming. Their fight was short and brutal, ending with Nantan standing over Finn's still body. Meanwhile, Croft, seeing his plan in ruins, had made a run for the cabin, a lit torch in his hand. He was going to throw it through the window to finish the job himself. Abigail saw him, a desperate, hate-filled man, illuminated by the flames of her burning barn. She leveled the empty shotgun at him. "Drop it, Peter." He laughed, a crazed, high-pitched sound. "It's over, you whore. If I can't have this land, no one will." He lunged for the window. But as he did, Hask, bleeding and enraged, tackled him from the side. The two men went down in a heap. The torch flew from Croft's hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt. Hask, with a roar, pinned Croft to the ground, his massive hand on the man's throat. For a moment, Abigail was sure he was going to kill him. "No," Nantan's voice cut through his brother's rage. "He is not worth it. He will face their justice." Suddenly, another group of riders appeared, this time from the main road. It was Sheriff Cole and a posse of deputies drawn by the sounds of the battle. They took in the scene of carnage, the burning barn, the bodies littering the yard, and Haske holding a terrified Peter Croft by the throat. What in God's name happened here? The sheriff demanded, his gun drawn. "He brought a mob to kill us," Abigail said, her voice shaking but clear. "To burn us out." "She's lying," Croft squeaked, his voice strained under Haske's grip. "They attacked us. These savages." "Is that so?" said the sheriff, his eyes hard. He dismounted and walked over to one of the fallen men Abigail had shot. "This man has a wife and 2 children. You brought him out here to die, Peter." "For what?" "For dirt." Just then, Nantan, who had been searching Finn's body, stood up. He was holding a small leather-bound ledger. He handed it to the sheriff. "What's this?" Cole asked. "Check the last pages," Nantan said. The sheriff flipped through the book. His eyes widened. This is Croft's private ledger. It details payments to Finn, bribes, extortion. My God, Peter." He looked up, his face a mask of disgust. "It's all here, including the original loan to Thomas Miller. It was $1,000. He paid back every cent before he died. The rest of the debt, you fabricated it all." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The lie that had started everything was exposed. Abigail stared at Croft, not with hate, but with a sudden weary understanding. He wasn't a monster. He was just a small, greedy man. Sheriff Cole holstered his pistol. "Haske, let him go." Haske hesitated, then released his grip. The sheriff hauled Croft to his feet. "Peter Croft, you're under arrest for incitement to riot, for attempted murder, and for fraud. You'll hang for this." As the deputies rounded up the sniveling banker, Abigail looked at her home. The barn was a roaring inferno. The cabin was scorched, and the yard was a scene of death. But they were alive. They had won. She rushed to Haske's side, tearing a strip from her dress to press against his bleeding shoulder. Nantan joined them, his hand resting on his brother's good arm. The 3 of them stood there, bruised, bleeding, and surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, their shadows dancing in the firelight. They were no longer just allies. They were a family forged in fire and blood, and they had defended their home. In the embers of that violent night, a new world was born. Peter Croft's reign of greed ended at the end of a rope, and the town of Cutter's Creek, faced with the undeniable truth of his evil, was forced into a long, quiet reckoning with its own prejudice. The story of the widow and her 2 Apache defenders became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered with a mixture of fear and awe. For Abigail, Nantan, and Haske, the fight was over, but their journey was just beginning. They rebuilt the barn beam by beam. They coaxed new life from the scarred earth, their hands working in unison. The silence of the homestead was replaced by the sound of shared labor, quiet conversations, and eventually laughter. The final wall between them crumbled, not in a single moment, but through 1,000 small acts of trust, care, and a love that defied all definition. Abigail found in their unconventional union a safety, a passion, and a sense of belonging she had never known. They were her shield, her heart, her home. Their story reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood or by law, but forged in the fires of adversity. It teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found when we dare to open our door to the strangers brought in by the storm. What would you have done in Abigail's place? Let us know in the comments below. If their story of survival and forbidden love moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed heart of the Old West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.